Wow, that was an incredible introduction. Actually, is that recorded? Because I'm gonna send that to my wife. Well, first of all, thank you CityWorks Expo for throwing this event. Thank you for all of the people working the event. Thank you to Roanoke, and thank you everyone who was in the audience at 4:10 p.m. on a Friday. That's incredible, and I really hope you, I hate being in the way of everybody's weekend and all the great stuff they have planned tonight, but if you make it through this with me, I promise each of you who can drink a drink on Aaron. All right, so we can go to the next slide. And I am going to talk to you about a thing that I love, a place that I love. First of all, how many of you are from around here? Okay. And keep the hands up for me. And how many of you who are not from around here are from the South? Where are you from?
Columbia, South Carolina.
Columbia, South Carolina. You?
Plainview, Texas.
Where in Texas?
Plainview.
Okay, Plainview.
Texas.
Okay. I am from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Yeah. And I know most of Virginia pretty well because I've lived here for a little while. I've gone up and down the roads. I love the highways. And I think I've been to all the states in the South, enough places to definitively say that the South is the best place in the world. We got the best food. We got the best accents. We got the best football teams, best sports teams in general. And we do pretty well. And I think we and our people, our mix of cultures and languages and ideas are really what drives the American soul. And the South has been sort of a crucible for America and what we want to be. And it always has been. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is how certain older ideas and how certain things that date back all the way to the Civil War have defined who we are as a region, and how, yes, some things that were less great about the South still define what we do and who we are. But also how people, like all of you in this room, are changing that and really changing, I believe, the course of the country and the course of the region. So, I'm going to start with a story about her. This is Rosanell Eaton. She is 95 years old. Spiffy too, right? And she gave me, I interviewed her a couple weeks ago, and she gave me one of the most inspirational stories I've ever heard in my life. Mrs. Eaton was born in Franklin County, North Carolina. Points if you know where that is. Franklin County, North Carolina, rural area. She was born in 1921. And in 1921, in Franklin County, North Carolina, black people did not vote. You hear the stories about the Klan intimidating people or people being turned back at the polls from literacy tests or poll taxes. But the saddest thing in what she recollects to me and what I've heard is that those things weren't even all that necessary at the time because they had worked so well before. So the idea of voting as a black person in North Carolina was just so unthinkable and unspeakable for people like Rosanell Eaton back then that they just didn't try. They didn't go. They knew that something would happen on the way, so the idea of voting just was not part of the civic identity of black people in the South. However, Mrs. Eaton studied history, and she was one of the few women in the town to go on and get a secondary education and degree. And she found that people before her in North Carolina, black people, voted. And they had 80% turnout, which is incredible. You think about 80% turnout in the 1800s of people voting, like people taking horses and buggies and walking 8, 9, 10 miles to go vote. 80% turnout. And she thought about it and said, why can't I and why shouldn't I vote? So Mrs. Eaton, in 1942, got in a mule cart with her brother and her mother. And they drove, did you drive mule carts? You drive them, right? Okay. She drove the mule cart a couple hours to the city center, Lewisburg, and went to the courthouse. And in the courthouse, she opened the doors up, and there's 3 registrars there, and she asked to register to vote. And this is, again, part of the unthinkability of black people voting in 1942. The registrars did not even know what to do. Can we let her vote? What do we do? There's nothing in the books. There's nothing in behind us on the wall saying what we're supposed to do if a black person comes in and asks to vote. And so they knew they had to make it hard. That's all. They asked Mrs. Eaton to recite the preamble to the Constitution, look at a spot in the wall behind them, hands down, and if she missed a single word, if she stuttered, if she stammered, if she hesitated, she would not be eligible to vote. She got up there and she did it. Yeah. Start to finish. Now, whether they knew or realized the irony of making her recite something about all people being created equal in order to have to vote, I'm not sure. But she registered. And she has voted in every single election, local, state, national, since she's been registered in 1942. That's not the end of the story, though. Rosanell Eaton also became an activist in voting rights. She was actually one of the first people in the county, one of the first black women in the state to be allowed to register other people to vote as a volunteer. And over the course of her 70-plus years of activism, she's registered 10,000 or more people to vote in the state. So she's a one-woman civil rights movement, right? Her story is important, though, today because in North Carolina, I don't know if you've heard about it, there has been a big debate over a new law in North Carolina and in all the states across the South about new voting laws. In 2013, the North Carolina General Assembly passed a law that got rid of early voting, got rid of same-day registration, established voter IDs. And these were policies that were ruled by the courts to be almost, I think the quote was, they targeted African Americans with surgical precision. That's a court saying that. And for her, Mrs. Rosanell Eaton, the woman who had gone miles and miles on a mule cart to register to vote, she told me it was harder for her to register in 2014 than it was in 1942. She had to go and get her birth certificate reconciled with her registration because the names were different. It took between 12 and 15 hours to do that as a 95-year-old woman driving 200-plus miles across the state to get the required documents. Now imagine, she's a registered poll observer, volunteer, registers tens of thousands of people to vote. If it's difficult for her, imagine how difficult that is for someone who maybe hasn't voted, someone who is her age and lives in the same place but does not know what to do or where to get your ID or who to contact. It's almost impossible. And next slide. She told me that, again, it was more difficult for her to vote in 2014 than in 1942. And the story, I'm going to get there, the story about her voting and the history that she learned and what she told me and what's actually happening across the South is an echo of Reconstruction. We're in Virginia, and I think, if you see all the marble statues, all the nice universities, the Lee Jackson highways, the Jefferson Davis roads and schools, I think we know that the Civil War never really ended, right? Whether you want to call it the War of Northern Aggression, lost cause, whatever, it has not ended. It shapes us to this day. And the war, the fight for who we want to be as a region, as a country, who we want to vote, who we want to be able to participate in this grand experiment of America has always been this picture right here. And to give you a little history lesson, I hope I don't bore you too bad, but again, drinks on Aaron, if I do. Reconstruction. So the Civil War, it was over. The fighting was over. And the grand experiment of Reconstruction began. Even more so than today, more so than this eclectic and diverse group of people in this room, Reconstruction was the most radical experiment at racial diversity and racial progress and cross-class participation in the American experiment that we've ever had. It's amazing. And for 20 years, black people voted and could vote. And they voted for, there were more black people in Congress and state politics than there ever have been 125 plus years ago. What happened, though? So, what happened was there were lots of folks who didn't like that. You had a region that had been defined by one group of people's dominance over the other. And the Three-Fifths Compromise gave them that much more power just for owning people. So not only do you take that power away, you give it to the people they once owned. That's difficult. And the project was saying, we're going to fold all these people into society and allow them to vote and allow them to be citizens overnight. And people didn't like that. So that's where we get the Klan, good old people with the hoods and all that good stuff. And we get other groups like them, and we have politicians who sort of run on the other side of legitimacy with the Klan. And they work in tandem in the 1800s, late 1800s, to say, look, we are going to do everything we can short of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to make it so people can't vote. And so that's when you get literacy tests. They're technically legal. I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't make somebody take a test to vote, right? Same thing with if all you people from Virginia, the idea of making it so people with felonies could not vote, that came from then. People think about it. Why can't people in prisons vote? It's because in 1900, Virginia Congress people came together and said, we don't want black people to vote, and this is all on record, but you know what? If we can make stealing a crime for which you can lose the ballot, and then we can charge a lot of folks with stealing, boom, it's constitutional. And so the end of that, the end of Reconstruction, the end of that grand experiment, the end of the most racially progressive era in American politics came about via some really crafty, honestly, politicians today should sort of study how crafty these things were. And so that impacts people like Rosanell Eaton. She was born just 2 decades after the first Jim Crow constitutions came about. And how many Virginians in here were born before 1971? You? Okay, we got some folks. You, if you were born in Virginia before 1971, were actually born here during the Jim Crow Constitution of Virginia. So you were born during a period in which it was legal and had been legal for 100 years to disenfranchise black people. So this is recent. This is not stuff that's gone away, and this is what basically builds the character and what we believe about in the South. So next slide. So what happened recently? Shelby County versus Holder. We had a decision that basically got rid of the Voting Rights Act. If you know what the Voting Rights Act is, if you've seen the movie Selma, I don't want to kill the civil rights movement and not do it justice, but in 30 seconds, the civil rights movement did some things, And probably the biggest of those things was the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act basically rolled back all of those crazy poll taxes, literacy tests, things that they made it difficult for black people to vote. And Shelby County versus Holder, Chief Justice Roberts in 2013 said that the country has changed, and we are no longer the nation that we were. I agree with him. But the reason I agree is because we had the Voting Rights Act. And he said we no longer needed it because the country's changed. Now, I tend to agree with other justices who said you can't sit under an umbrella and say it's not raining anymore. And so they got rid of some of the most important provisions of this Voting Rights Act, and that put us squarely in the position where states who had been held back by the Voting Rights Act from doing certain things said, look, we can actually roll back voting rights for people and get away with it again. And that's exactly what happened in North Carolina. It's what happened in Texas. It's what happened in South Carolina and Alabama. And they established these voter ID laws and these nice disenfranchising laws that, same type of deal where it's like, we're not really being racist. We're not really disenfranchising people from voting. It's just, hey, coincidentally, lots of people are not going to be able to vote because we do this. And what I want to really impress, and the core of my message here, is any other era in America, any other time in America, any other group of people living in America, those bills would have passed and been law today. However, the one in North Carolina now is not. It's been stricken down by the courts. And what I firmly believe, and I think it's evidenced, again, by the people in this room and by the people I've seen on the road and by the incredible people like Rosanell Eaton who are fighting, is that the South is different. Is that there are now people in the South who believe in the old Reconstruction experiment of putting together coalitions of people who work together for making the country better for everybody. We get a bad rep, right? Everybody says we're a bunch of hillbillies. We're a bunch of people. I'm not saying being a hillbilly is a bad thing because, But they say, we're a bunch of hicks who don't know anything, who, we are all defined by this singular idea of racism. And I, through the people that I've seen and through the people like Rosanell Eaton and her grandchildren and the people that work with her and the Latino activists and LGBT activists in North Carolina and Alabama and Florida, what I've seen in my reporting in the Atlantic and as a Southerner is that maybe for the first time since that experiment in the 1870s, we are in a place where we can move past and we can actually build a foundation of a world that is inclusive and not exclusive. And that excites me. And so this map was put together, and I like to give different definitions of the South. This map was put together during the Voting Rights Act. And basically it highlighted all the places that had discriminatory voting laws in effect in 1965. And I've been to each of these states, and I've been to reporting in most of these little blue counties and most of the red counties. And what I've seen in each of them is that people are not sitting by and letting sort of the legacy of the past define who they are and what they do. And there are still people who say, look, we don't want to be a region of ideas and a people who are inclusive. But I firmly believe now that there's enough of people who disagree and who want more to change and to turn the tide. This is a North Carolina NAACP voter turnout rally. Here, the election is about more than choosing a candidate or party. It's the climax of a 3-year fight against some of the most restrictive voting laws in the country.
Discrimination down through history has turned on the issue of who is a person and who deserves citizenship. We are citizens. We are persons. We are made in the image of God. And
North Carolina could swing the election this year, and I want to know what's important to voters in my home state. I'm bringing along my little brother to find out because, like a lot of teenagers, Richard doesn't really see how politics affects him.
Like, I have a year till I can vote, but if I could have, I don't know. I don't know if I would have went to vote, because I figured my one vote's not really going to do much.
With this trip, I'm hoping to show him just why voting is so important to people in the state. Our first stop is a town named for Zebulon B. Vance, the Confederate governor of North Carolina during the Civil War.
The election right now, it makes me scared. It makes me scared because what I have this country, I don't have it in my country.
What country are you from?
I'm from Gambia.
Gambia.
Yeah, I'm from West Africa. I'm from Gambia.
Because of the new restrictive voting law, Bimta had trouble voting in the primary election just a few months ago.
It makes me like I can't vote because I went to Zebulon here. They said it's not here. So I was confused and mad. I don't vote and I have to vote. This election is not like white or black. This election is for America, our future.
Just being in a hair shop talking about politics. Yeah,
Yeah, that was something new.
in a beauty shop. I mean, you don't talk about politics in a barber shop?
I don't talk about politics.
Of course, we had to stop by my hometown. You know, we were just in Zebulon where we talked to people from Gambia, and they were afraid of Trump and his policies on immigration.
If she wants to be an American, just like us standing here, she would want the very same thing that we want. She wants secure borders. Look at what's going on in the country today. Suicide bombers.
I also feel like our country has regressed. I grew up in the country, and some of my best friends were black, you know, then they were my playmates, love them to this day, and I don't see that now. It's just a lot of concerns I have, and I would like to see morality brought back, that people cared for each other, the love.
Underneath all that anxiety is a fight over the most fundamental right of all, the right to vote. Just a few decades ago, the specter of Jim Crow hung over voting in North Carolina. Literacy tests were in place until the 1970s. Hope for black voters came with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because the state could no longer restrict access to the polls without federal approval. But all that changed in 2013 when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Soon after, North Carolina's Republican legislature passed a law that seemed to target voters of color. Voters had to show a state-issued ID. Teenagers could no longer register to vote in advance. It eliminated early voting on the day many black people vote with their church, and it limited where you can vote. Altogether, it made it harder for hundreds of thousands of people to access the polls. Reverend Barber and the North Carolina NAACP held dozens of Moral Monday protests over what they describe as a return to Jim Crow. Then, just months before the election, a federal court threw all these rules out because they're designed to, quote, target African Americans with almost surgical precision. So North Carolina's voting restrictions were struck down, but more than a dozen other states have put up new barriers to voting that are in effect for the 2016 election. I wanted to come out here because some of the earliest political discourses I had outside of the barbershop, outside of my family, were talking with people fishing.
What did you learn today?
What I saw today was people are voting not based on what we think about voting on interest, voting on what you believe in. What people are voting on is they're voting on fear.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to go on a trip with you, because I was afraid about you. Richard is coming of age in North Carolina where fear and anxiety are everywhere. The question is, will that motivate a new generation of voters or discourage them? The voting restrictions are gone, but maybe the damage has already been done. Or maybe not.
Maybe you thought messing with our vote would divide us. but boy, did you get it wrong. You have united us. You have brought us together in ways that maybe we otherwise wouldn't be together, and we're going to send a shock throughout this nation that says when you mess with the right to vote, you wake up a giant.
My brother looks pretty cool, right? So I wanted to close on those words that Reverend Barber said, and I want to discuss those a little bit because it's really what I've seen in working with environmental activists in Alabama, in working with people in Mississippi who are working with immigrant rights, and it's a thing I've seen. I think you've probably guessed I'm a liberal. It's a thing I've seen across both sides of the aisle, with Democrats, with Republicans, with people who identify with every political orientation and party. What I've seen with people right now who are working in Florida to make sure that, there's a full recovery from the hurricane, with the people who do all these type of disaster responses, with the city of Charleston after this shooting. What I've seen and what Reverend Barber is referring to is we've had the same type of backlash in the last 10 years that we saw during Reconstruction. We've had the same kind of really visceral, almost instinctive push to say, look, we want to be this old thing. We're going to respond to fear and danger as a region, as a state, by going backwards, by saying, look, maybe things were better in 1950 or 1965. But unlike other times in history, unlike other eras, unlike other people that I think, groups of people that made the policy, people like the Moral Mondays movement, people like Reverend Barber, and college students and disaster workers, they're saying no. They're saying, I want my idea of the South is something that is greater than the sum of its parts. It's something that is a group of people working together for a collective destiny. And as a Southerner, I believe that that's our biggest strength. And I believe that I'm here speaking to folks in Roanoke as part of that strength. And I know there's people here who disagree with each other on politics and may disagree with where we're going in 2016, with who you want to vote for in the election. But I think what Reverend Barber is speaking to is solid. Members of that coalition of Republicans, Democrats, and they are responding to the idea of fear, not by dividing each other, but by banding together. And when I was first asked to come speak, and I was thinking, what am I going to say? I don't know. Something about small towns, I was thinking. Something about Rocky Mount. Something about road trips. And all those ideas, to me, were just manifestations of this one that I'm trying to say and enjoy and really present, is that the South is at a crossroads. It's at a turning point. And I truly believe right now that we are in the midst of a renaissance. And I'm hoping you do too.